He came to town for supplies. He left with a wife he had never met before. What made this man defy everyone to marry a stranger in front of the whole town? And what did he see in her that no one else did? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The scorching sun beat down on the dusty main street of Willow Creek, a small frontier town in Colorado Territory, 1875. Thomas Miller, a 28-year-old rancher with weathered hands and honest eyes, rode into town on his chestnut Marries. He needed supplies before returning to his modest homestead 10 miles outside of town. "Morning, Thomas," called Samuel, the general store owner. "Beautiful day, ain't it?" Thomas dismounted, tying his horse to the post. "If you enjoy being cooked alive, I suppose it is." He wiped sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. "Need flour, coffee, and some nails. The fence on the north side needs fixing." As Samuel gathered the supplies, commotion from the town square caught Thomas's attention. A crowd had gathered, voices rising in a cacophony of excitement. "What's happening over there?" Thomas asked. Samuel glanced out the window and frowned. "The Bartons are at it again. Heard they're auctioning off their late son's wife. Poor girl. Her husband's been dead less than 3 months." Thomas's jaw tightened. Auctioning her like property? They claim she owes them for her keep. Word is they never liked her. Eastern girl, educated, too fancy for their tastes. Now that their son's gone, they want to be rid of her, preferably at a profit. A righteous anger surged through Thomas. He'd heard of such things happening in remote areas where law was more suggestion than rule, but he'd never witnessed it firsthand. "That's not right," he muttered, heading toward the door. "Thomas," Samuel called after him, "don't go causing trouble. The Bartons have friends in this town." But Thomas was already striding across the street. The crowd had grown, mostly men, some calling out numbers as a red-faced man in overalls stood on a crate, pointing to a young woman beside him. She stood with quiet dignity despite the humiliation, her brown hair neatly tied back, her simple dress clean but worn. Her eyes, though Thomas caught his breath when he saw them. They blazed with a mixture of fury and desperation, glimmering with unshed tears she refused to let fall. $20 for a healthy young woman," shouted Ezra Barton. "She can cook, clean, and mend. Might not be much to look at, but she work hard." "25, called a grizzled miner. 30, countered the blacksmith. The woman's gaze dropped to the ground, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Thomas pushed through the crowd, disgust rising in his throat. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Ezra Barton sneered. "Mind your business, Miller. This here's a legal transaction." "Legal? You're selling a human being. She's my daughter-in-law, and she owes us. My boy's been feeding and housing her for years, and now he's gone. We ain't running a charity." The woman looked up then, meeting Thomas's eyes. Something passed between them, a silent plea, a moment of connection amid the sordid spectacle. "What's your name?" Thomas asked her directly. Before she could answer, Ezra cut in. "Her name's Elizabeth. From Boston originally. Filled my son's head with foolish notions. Now, are you bidding or wasting our time?" Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "I have a right to speak for myself, Mr. Barton." Her voice was clear, educated, with a strength that belied her vulnerable position. "My husband, your son, would be ashamed of what you're doing. Don't you speak of my boy." Ezra's face flushed darker. $40. Do I hear 40? Thomas stepped forward. $100, he said firmly. A murmur ran through the crowd. Elizabeth's eyes widened. 100? Ezra looked stunned, then pleased. "Well now, that's more like it. Anyone going higher?" 100 once, twice, on one condition, Thomas interrupted. "She comes with me as my lawfully wedded wife, not as property. We go to the preacher right now." Elizabeth gasped softly. "What difference does it make to you?" Ezra scoffed. "It makes all the difference in the world," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "Do we have a deal?" Ezra conferred briefly with his wife, who nodded eagerly at the mention of $100. "Fine, Ezra agreed. But money first, then the preacher. Thomas turned to Elizabeth. Miss, I know this is sudden and strange, but I'm offering you a choice, which is more than these people are giving you. I have a small ranch. It's not much, but it's peaceful. I won't ever treat you as property. If you'd rather take your chances elsewhere, I'll still pay your debt and see you safely to the next town. Elizabeth studied him, measuring his character in that tense moment. Finally, she spoke. And if I choose to marry you, then I'll be a respectful husband. We can build a life together, or live as companions until you decide what you truly want. I give you my word. She took a deep breath. I accept your offer of marriage, Mr. Miller, Thomas Miller. As they walked toward this small white church at the end of the street, Elizabeth whispered, Why would you do this for a stranger? Thomas kept his eyes forward. Because no person should be treated as property. And because sometimes, Miss Elizabeth, life gives us unexpected chances to do what's right. The church bell tolled once as they stepped inside, marking the beginning of a union born of desperation and decency, an unlikely foundation for what neither yet knew would become so much more. The wedding was a sparse affair. Reverend Howard looked between Thomas and Elizabeth with poorly concealed suspicion, but proceeded with the ceremony nonetheless. Elizabeth's hands trembled as Thomas slipped a simple gold band, his mother's, onto her finger. The Bartons counted their money in the back pew, not bothering to hide their satisfaction at the transaction. I now pronounce you man and wife, the Reverend declared, closing his Bible with a snap that echoed in the nearly empty church. May God bless this ... union. Thomas nodded respectfully. Thank you, Reverend. Outside, the afternoon sun had softened its assault, casting long shadows across the town. Thomas helped Elizabeth onto his mare, then mounted behind her. The physical proximity was awkward for both, her back stiff against his chest. I need to collect my supplies, Thomas said. Then we'll head home. Elizabeth nodded silently, her composure finally beginning to crack now that the ordeal was ending. Thomas pretended not to notice the single tear that escaped down her cheek. At the general store, Samuel raised his eyebrows but said nothing as Thomas settled his account and secured the supplies to his horse. The townspeople watched with undisguised curiosity as the newly married couple departed, rumors already flying about the rancher who'd bought himself a bride. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, the rhythm of the horses' hooves the only sound between them. The landscape opened up before them, rolling hills, grassy plains, and in the distance, the silhouette of mountains against the darkening sky. It's beautiful out here, Elizabeth finally said, her voice small against the vastness around them. It is, Thomas agreed. Quieter than Boston, I imagine. Yes, she paused. How did you know I'm from Boston? Your father-in-law, I mean, Mr. Barton mentioned it. Former father-in-law, she corrected quietly. And now I have a new husband I know nothing about. Thomas guided the horse around a rocky outcropping. Not much to tell. My parents came west when I was 12. Father died of fever when I was 19. Mother followed 3 years later. Been on my own since, working the land they claimed. It's not a grand life, but it's honest. I'm sorry about your parents, she said. And I'm sorry about your husband, he returned. The Barton's son, what was his name? William, she said, the name catching slightly in her throat. He was kind, nothing like his parents. He had dreams of building something better than what he came from. What happened to him? Pneumonia. It took him quickly. Her voice remained steady, but Thomas sensed the grief beneath. His parents blamed me for not nursing him properly. In truth, the doctor said nothing could have saved him. They crested a hill, and Thomas pointed ahead. That's my place. Our place now, I suppose. The homestead was modest but well-maintained, a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn, corral, and fenced pasture where a small herd of cattle grazed. A vegetable garden stood to one side, and an apple tree, heavy with early fruit, shaded the front yard. As they approached, Thomas felt a strange nervousness. He'd never shared this space with anyone since his mother died. It's not much, he said apologetically. It's a home, Elizabeth replied. That's more than I had this morning. He helped her dismount, noting how she winced slightly. The ride was long. You must be tired. I'm fine, she insisted, though her legs were clearly unsteady. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean, one main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a small kitchen area, and a narrow staircase leading to what Elizabeth presumed was a loft bedroom. Are you hungry? Thomas asked, lighting a lamp as dusk gathered outside. I'm no great cook, but I can manage beans and bacon. I can cook, Elizabeth offered. It would give me something useful to do. Thomas hesitated. You don't need to earn your keep, Elizabeth. You're not a servant. I know, she said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since they'd left town. But I need to feel useful, to have purpose, please. Understanding, he nodded. The pantry's there. I'll tend to the horse. When he returned, savory aromas filled the cabin. Elizabeth had not only prepared bacon and beans, but had found cornmeal and made Johnny cakes as well. She'd set the table with his mismatched dishes, arranging them more neatly than he ever bothered to do. They ate mostly in silence, the awkwardness of their situation hanging between them. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. About sleeping arrangements, he began uncomfortably. I'll take the chair by the fire. You can have the bedroom upstairs. Elizabeth looked up from her plate. This is your home. I can't take your bed. I insist, he said firmly. You're my wife now, at least on paper. I meant what I said about respecting you. She studied him in the lamplight, her expression softening slightly. Thank you. Later, as Elizabeth settled into the unfamiliar bed upstairs, she stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the day's extraordinary events. This morning, she'd been a grieving widow facing humiliation and an uncertain future. Tonight, she was the wife of a stranger who'd shown her more kindness than her husband's family ever had. Downstairs, Thomas shifted uncomfortably in the chair, listening to the occasional creak of floorboards above as his new wife prepared for sleep. He wondered if he'd been impulsive, if this arrangement could possibly work. Yet when he recalled the dignity in her eyes as she'd stood before that jeering crowd, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Good night, Elizabeth, he whispered to the silent room, not expecting an answer, but needing somehow to acknowledge the presence that had changed his solitary home forever. Upstairs, as if hearing his unspoken thoughts, Elizabeth whispered into her pillow, Good night, Thomas Miller. Thank you for today. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the cabin windows. Elizabeth woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in her only other dress, a faded blue cotton, and made her way downstairs. Thomas was already gone, but he'd left coffee brewing on the stove. A note sat propped against a cup. In the barn, help yourself to breakfast. She poured herself coffee, noticing how he'd arranged bread, butter, and preserves on the table before leaving. Such a simple courtesy, yet it touched her deeply after months of being treated as a burden by the Bartons. After eating, Elizabeth explored the cabin more thoroughly. It was plain but solid, built with care. The furnishings were sparse but functional, a bookshelf with a dozen well-worn volumes, a rocking chair by the window, a desk with neat stacks of papers. Everything spoke of a man who lived simply but intentionally. She found a broom and began sweeping, then washed the breakfast dishes. Work had always been her comfort, the way she imposed order on chaos. By mid-morning, she'd straightened the entire downstairs and was eyeing the dusty curtains when Thomas entered. You didn't need to clean, he said, removing his hat. I wanted to, she replied. I hope you don't mind. No, it's fine. He looked around, clearly noticing the difference. Thank you. An awkward silence fell between them. I thought I might show you around the property, Thomas offered. Unless you'd prefer to rest? I'd like to see it, Elizabeth said quickly, grateful for the suggestion. Outside, the day had warmed pleasantly. Thomas guided her through the barnyard, introducing her to the animal's 2 workhorses. His riding Marries, a milk cow, chickens, and a friendly dog named Scout who followed them everywhere. The garden needs attention, Thomas admitted as they walked past rows of vegetables competing with weeds. I manage the essentials, but there's always more to do than time to do it. I could help with that, Elizabeth offered. I kept a small garden in Boston, and I learned more from the neighbors here after William and I married. Thomas nodded. I'd appreciate that. They walked to the edge of a wheat field, golden stalks swaying in the breeze. I'll harvest this next month, he explained. It's not a large crop, but it supplements what I make from the cattle. Elizabeth shielded her eyes against the sun. It's beautiful. All of this is. It can be harsh too, Thomas cautioned. Winters are long. Summers can bring drought. Spring brings floods sometimes. It's not an easy life. Few lives are truly easy, she replied, thinking of her own journey. But some difficulties are worth facing. As they returned to the house, Thomas seemed to make a decision. I need to ride out and check the north fence line. Would you like to come along? I could show you more of the property. Surprised by the invitation, Elizabeth hesitated only briefly. I would, yes. He saddled the mare for her and took the larger gelding for himself. Can you ride alone? He asked. William taught me, she said, mounting with reasonable confidence. They rode side by side across the rolling landscape, Thomas pointing out landmarks, the creek that never ran dry, the ridge that marked his boundary, the distant smoke from his nearest neighbor's chimney, 3 miles away. It's so vast, Elizabeth marveled. In Boston, and even in town with the Bartons, everything felt close, confined. Here, I feel like I can breathe. Thomas glanced at her, noting the color in her cheeks, the way the tension had eased from her shoulders. Freedom has its appeal, he agreed. At the damaged section of fence, Thomas dismounted to work. Elizabeth watched as he efficiently replaced broken posts and tightened wire, his movements practiced and sure. May I ask you something personal? She ventured after a while. Thomas paused, wiping his brow. You may. Why haven't you married before? A man with land. A home ... She left the question hanging. He returned to his work, considering his answer. Never met the right woman, I suppose. Or perhaps I was too focused on building something lasting here to notice if I did. He hammered a nail with more force than necessary. And you? How did you meet William Barton? Elizabeth stroked her horse's neck, remembering. I was teaching at a small school in Denver. He came to town selling horses. He was different from his family, gentle, curious about the world. We married after just 3 months. Her voice grew quiet. His parents never approved. They thought he should have chosen a local girl who understood ranch life. Someone more ... useful. You seem plenty useful to me, Thomas said simply. Anyone who can make Johnny cakes like you did last night has practical value. The unexpected compliment startled a laugh from her, a bright, genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. They returned home as afternoon shadows lengthened. Working together, they prepared a simple supper, moving around each other in the small kitchen with growing ease. I was thinking, Thomas said as they ate, there's a trunk in the attic with some of my mother's things, dresses and such. They might fit you with some alterations. Better than having just 2 dresses to your name. Elizabeth's fork paused midway to her mouth. That's very kind. Are you certain you want to part with them? They're no use to anyone packed away, he said practically. My mother would have approved, I think. She was practical that way. After supper, Thomas brought down the trunk. Together, they opened it to find neatly folded dresses, shawls, and a winter coat, all carefully preserved. She must have been a remarkable woman, Elizabeth said softly, touching the well-made garments. She was, Thomas agreed, a note of pride in his voice. Strong, determined. She made this place a home when it was nothing but wild land. Elizabeth held up a blue dress against herself. It might need to be taken in a bit. There's a sewing box in there too, I believe, Thomas said, rummaging deeper in the trunk. His hand emerged with a small wooden box, intricately carved. This was hers. She taught herself to sew by candlelight after working all day. As Elizabeth opened the box to find neatly arranged needles, thread, and scissors, their hands brushed briefly. Both withdrew quickly. But something had changed in that simple contact. a momentary bridge across the careful distance they'd maintained. "Thank you, Thomas," Elizabeth said earnestly, "for everything." He nodded, suddenly unable to meet her eyes. "It's getting late. I should let you rest." That night, as Elizabeth carefully hung her new old dresses in the small wardrobe upstairs, she realized she hadn't thought about William or the Bartons all afternoon. The guilt came swiftly. Was she forgetting so soon? But as she touched the simple gold band on her finger, she understood that remembering William didn't mean she couldn't find peace in her new circumstances. Perhaps even happiness, eventually. Downstairs, Thomas again settled into his chair by the dying fire, Scout curled at his feet. The house felt different with Elizabeth in it, warmer somehow, despite the physical distance they maintained. He knew their arrangement was unusual, born of crisis rather than affection. Yet he couldn't deny the quiet contentment he felt knowing she was safe under his roof. "One day at a time," he murmured to himself, echoing his father's favorite saying. One day at a time. 3 weeks passed, settling into a rhythm neither Thomas nor Elizabeth had anticipated. They worked side by side during daylight hours, he with the livestock and fields, she with the garden and household. The awkwardness between them gradually dissolved into a comfortable companionship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Elizabeth had transformed the cabin. Curtains were cleaned and mended, floors scrubbed to a shine, and wildflowers appeared in jars on the table. The garden flourished under her attention, weeds banished and vegetables thriving. She'd altered several of his mother's dresses to fit her slender frame, adding simple embellishments that made them her own. Thomas, for his part, found himself working with renewed energy. Tasks he'd long postponed were completed, repairs made, improvements undertaken. He built shelves for her growing collection of preserved foods and constructed a better chicken coop. If the neighbors noticed the transformation of his homestead, they tactfully avoided mentioning it during their infrequent visits. They still maintained their separate sleeping arrangements, though Thomas had built himself a proper cot downstairs, rather than continuing to use the chair. Their conversations grew longer each evening, spanning books they'd read, places they'd seen, and gradually, deeper matters of belief and hope. On this particular morning, Thomas announced over breakfast, "I need to go into town for supplies. Would you like to come along?" Elizabeth hesitated, her hands stilling around her coffee cup. "Will the Bartons be there?" "Possibly," he admitted. "But you're my wife now. They have no claim on you." She considered this, then straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I'll come. I can't avoid town forever." The ride to Willow Creek was pleasant, the summer day mild with a gentle breeze. They talked easily about plans for a new storage shed and whether to expand the garden next season. Anyone observing them might have taken them for a long-married couple rather than virtual strangers bound by an unusual arrangement. As they approached town, however, Elizabeth grew quiet. Thomas noticed her tension and guided his horse closer to hers. "We don't have to stay long," he assured her. "Just supplies and we'll head back." She nodded gratefully. "I'm being foolish. It's just the last time I was here wasn't my finest moment." "You showed more dignity that day than anyone else in that square," Thomas said firmly. "Hold your head high." The town appeared unchanged, though eyes followed them as they rode down the main street. Thomas helped Elizabeth dismount outside the general store, consciously taking her hand longer than necessary, a small gesture of solidarity noticed by watching townspeople. Inside, Samuel greeted them with friendly curiosity. "Mrs. Miller, good to see you again. You're looking well." Elizabeth smiled politely. "Thank you, Mr. Sanders. Your store is very well stocked." As Thomas selected supplies, Elizabeth browsed the fabric section, considering material for new curtains. She was examining a bolt of calico when a harsh voice cut through the quiet store. "Well, if it isn't the Boston girl, playing at being a proper wife again." Martha Barton stood in the doorway, her thin face pinched with disapproval. Behind her loomed Ezra, his expression equally sour. Thomas moved immediately to Elizabeth's side, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Hello, Mrs. Barton," Elizabeth said evenly. "Mr. Barton, I trust you're both well." Martha sniffed derisively. Don't pretend to care about our welfare. You never did, even when our William was alive. Elizabeth felt Thomas tense beside her, but kept her voice calm. I cared deeply for your son. His happiness was important to me. Not important enough to save him, Ezra growled. That's enough, Thomas interjected, his tone hard. Your son died of pneumonia. No one could have prevented that. What would you know about it? Martha demanded. You bought yourself a wife with no idea of her failings. The store had gone silent, other customers watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Elizabeth straightened to her full height. I nursed William day and night. I read to him when he was too weak to sit up. I held his hand as he drew his last breath while you both were in town. Her voice trembled but held strong. I loved your son, and he loved me. Nothing you say can change that. Martha's face contorted. You filled his head with nonsense. City ideas that had no place here. He wanted to move away, abandon his responsibilities to us. He wanted a life of his own, Elizabeth corrected gently, as all children eventually do. Ezra stepped forward menacingly, but Thomas moved between them. Mr. Barton, this conversation is over. You've been paid what you demanded. Elizabeth is my wife now. Any grievance you had ended the moment that money changed hands. We took you for a fool, Ezra sneered. $100 for damaged goods. Before Thomas could respond, Elizabeth spoke. I am not goods, damaged or otherwise, Mr. Barton. I am a person who loved your son and mourned him deeply. I've found a new life now with a good man. I wish you could find peace as I have. The simple dignity of her words seemed to deflate the Bartons' anger, replacing it with something closer to confusion. Come, Thomas, Elizabeth said quietly. We have what we need here. Thomas paid Samuel for their supplies, the store still silent with tension. As they stepped outside, Elizabeth's composure finally wavered, her hands shaking as she reached for her horse. Wait, Thomas said softly. Taking her trembling hands in his, he looked into her eyes. I'm proud to have you as my wife, Elizabeth Miller. I want everyone in this town to know that. And there, on the main street of Willow Creek, with half the town watching through windows and doorways, Thomas Miller kissed his wife for the first time. It was gentle and brief, but in that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise, then softened. That should give them something new to gossip about, she whispered. Thomas laughed, a deep, genuine sound that turned heads. Let's go home. The ride back was quiet, both processing what had transpired. As their homestead came into view, golden in the late afternoon light, Elizabeth broke the silence. Thomas, I need to tell you something. He reined his horse to a stop, turning to face her. What is it? When William was dying, she began carefully, he made me promise something. He said, don't waste your life grieving. Find happiness again. I didn't understand how that would be possible then. She met his eyes steadily. I'm beginning to understand now. Thomas considered her words. Are you saying, I'm saying that what began as an arrangement of necessity has become something more to me, she said, her courage gathering. I don't expect you to feel the same. You've been more than generous, offering me a home and protection without asking anything in return. But I want you to know that I've grown to care for you, Thomas. Deeply. For a moment he was silent, and Elizabeth feared she'd misread everything. Then he dismounted and approached her horse, helping her down but not releasing her once her feet touched ground. Elizabeth, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I bought a marriage certificate that day, not expecting anything more than the satisfaction of doing what was right. But these weeks with you, he struggled to find words. You've brought life back to this place. To me. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. I think I've been falling in love with you since I saw you standing in that square, refusing to break despite everything. I just didn't know how to tell you without you thinking it was part of our arrangement. And now? She whispered, hardly daring to believe. Now I'm asking if you might consider making this marriage real in every way. Not because of gratitude or obligation, but because we found something neither of us expected. In answer, Elizabeth stood on tiptoe and kissed him, her arms encircling his neck. Against her lips, she felt him smile. That evening, as the sun set over their land, they sat together on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. Scout dozed at their feet, and the distant lowing of cattle mingled with the chirping of crickets. "I never thought I'd find this," Elizabeth murmured. "A true home, a second chance." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "My father used to say that life's greatest blessings often come disguised as its greatest challenges." "Your father was a wise man," she said. "I wish I could have known him. And your mother. They would have loved you," he assured her, "almost as much as I do." As darkness fell, they remained on the porch, watching stars appear one by one in the vast Colorado sky. Neither felt the need to rush inside. They had found each other against all odds, and now they had all the time in the world to build the life they both deserved together.